The air in the grand ballroom of the Hotel President Wilson was worth more than most people's homes. It was a heady blend of money and influence, scented with $100,000 floral arrangements and the mingling perfumes of Europe's elite. Crystal chandeliers, each the size of a small car, dripped light onto a sea of black ties and couture gowns. From my vantage point near the stage, the murmur of conversations in French, German, English, and Russian was a familiar symphony, the polite background music to my life's work. This was the annual Geneva Gala for the Children's Global Relief Fund, my gala, my kingdom. As director, I was more than a host. I was the high priestess of this secular religion called philanthropy. My job was to glide through this glittering ecosystem, smiling, shaking hands, and gently, persistently, reminding these titans of industry and finance that their legacies were best secured with a tax-deductible donation to my foundation. And I was very, very good at my job. Annelise, wonderful work as always, a Swiss banking magnate named Mr. Dubois murmured, his hand lingering a moment too long on my arm. The presentation on the Clean Water Initiative in West Africa was most compelling. Thank you, Jean-Luc, I said, my smile perfectly calibrated to be warm but professional. We were fortunate. The matching grant from the Kellerman Foundation was a godsend. We're hoping to break ground on the first 3 wells by Q2. Indeed. He nodded, his eyes already scanning the room for his next networking opportunity. Indeed. I moved on, a ghost in a midnight blue silk gown, my heels making no sound on the thick carpet. I saw my reflection in a mirrored column, a woman of 32, her dark hair pulled back in a severe but elegant chignon, her expression poised and unreadable. I looked every bit the part of Annelise Croix, the brilliant, driven director who had tripled the fund's endowment in 5 short years. I looked nothing like the girl I felt inside, the one who was still waiting for her parents to look at her with pride instead of with assessment dot, as if summoned by that traitorous thought. A stir rippled through the crowd near the grand entrance. The ambient chatter dipped, heads turned. Charles and Genevieve de Croix had arrived. My parents did not simply enter a room, they took possession of it. Father, tall and silver-haired, wore his tuxedo like a suit of armor, his face set, in the permanently unimpressed expression of a man who has never been told no. Mother, exquisite in a Chanel gown the color of champagne, was a masterpiece of preserved beauty, her diamonds catching the light and drawing all eyes to her. They were the undisputed royalty of Geneva's old money social scene, and they moved through the crowd with the serene confidence of lions strolling through a field of gazelles. They spotted me and began to make their way over, accepting greetings and air kisses as they went. I felt the familiar tightening in my chest, the instinct to brace for impact. Annelise, darling, Mother said, her lips brushing the air an inch from my cheek. Her eyes, the same cool gray as my own, swept over my dress. That color is very bold. It's the fund's official color, Mother, I replied smoothly. Of course it is, she said, her smile not quite reaching her eyes, always on brand. Your father and I were just speaking to the Von Hessels, Father said, bypassing greetings entirely. They were very impressed by the quarterly report. Good. Work. It reflects well on the family name. It reflects well on the family name. Not, we are so proud of you. Never that. For my parents, my success was not my own achievement. It was a satisfactory dividend paid on their genetic and social investment in me. My entire life had been a performance review. My grades at boarding school, my acceptance into the London School of Economics, my decision to enter the nonprofit sector instead of a more lucrative, and therefore more brag-worthy field like investment banking, every choice was weighed and measured against a single unspoken metric. How did it make them look? I had learned early on that their love was not a warm, unconditional thing. It was a currency to be earned and exchanged for good behavior and public success. This glittering, hypocritical world of performative charity was the only world they knew, the only one they had ever taught me. I had just learned the rules of the game better than they ever expected. The keynote speech is in 20 minutes, I said, gesturing towards their table at the front. I've seated you with the Swedish ambassador and Mr. Takeda from Sony. Excellent, Father nodded, already turning away. We'll catch up later, Annelise. They glided away, leaving me in their wake. I took a slow, steadying breath and pasted the professional smile back on my face. A waiter offered me a glass of champagne from his tray. I took it, the cold stem a welcome anchor in a sea of practiced pleasantries. For the next 20 minutes, I was the perfect hostess, laughing at jokes that weren't funny, accepting compliments, with practiced humility, and making every single person I spoke to feel like they were the most important person in the room. It was a lie, of course. They were all just numbers on a balance sheet, walking egos with checkbooks. I despised them, but they were my walking egos, and my job was to make them feel good enough to part with their money for children they would never meet in countries they could not find on a map. Finally, the lights dimmed. A hush fell over the ballroom. I took my seat at the head table, my heart beating a little faster. It was time for the main event. I introduced my parents with a glowing tribute I had written myself, full of words like visionary, compassion, and legacy. I spoke of their lifelong commitment to philanthropy, a commitment I had witnessed firsthand. The lie tasted like ash in my mouth, but the words flowed flawlessly. The crowd applauded warmly as my parents took the stage. Father approached the podium first. He was a master public speaker, his voice a rich baritone that commanded attention. He spoke of global responsibility, of the duty of the privileged to uplift the less fortunate. He praised the fund, and he praised me. And we have never been prouder, he said, looking directly at me, of our daughter, Annelise. She has taken the humble seed of this foundation and grown it into a mighty oak, sheltering thousands around the world. Her dedication is an inspiration to us all. The applause was deafening. People at the surrounding tables turned to smile at me, to pat my shoulder. I felt a flush of heat rise in my cheeks. For a dizzying, stupid second, I thought, he means it. He finally means it, Then Mother stepped up to the podium, her presence silencing the room. My husband speaks of inspiration, she began, her voice soft but carrying to every corner of the room. And as we have watched Annelise dedicate her life to this noble cause, we have been inspired to think about our own legacy. What is the point of accumulating wealth, of building empires of glass and steel, if not to leave the world a better place than we found it? She paused, her gaze sweeping across the rapt audience. She looked like a saint bathed in the warm glow of the spotlight. Charles and I have always believed that our greatest asset is not our portfolio, but our family name. And we have decided to make a gift that will ensure that name is associated with compassion and hope for generations to come. Here it comes, I thought. The announcement of a new wing for the hospital, the funding of a new scholarship, a respectable, sizable donation. We have one daughter, Mother continued, her eyes finding mine again. This time, her smile was different. It was proprietary, triumphant. And we have given her the best education, the best opportunities. We have given her the tools to build her own life, a life she has built with remarkable skill. And we realized the greatest gift we can still give her is the security of knowing that the work she is so passionate about will continue forever. A cold knot of dread began to form in my stomach. What is she saying? Father stepped forward, placing a hand on her shoulder. He looked out at the crowd, his expression grave and profound. My wife and I have spent months discussing our estate. he announced, his voice booming with false sincerity. And we have come to a decision, which is why, tonight, we are formally announcing our intention upon our passing to bequeath our entire estate, every franc, every share, every property, to the Children's Global Relief Fund. The world stopped. The sound in the ballroom, the clinking glasses, the soft music, the very air itself was sucked into a vacuum. My ears roared with a sudden, violent silence. My inheritance. My entire life's inheritance. Not a portion of it. Not a generous donation from it. All of it. It wasn't a gift. It was a public execution. A declaration in front of everyone who mattered in our world that I, their only child, was not worthy of carrying on their legacy. They were cutting me out, not with a quiet legal document, but with a symphony of public applause. They were disinheriting me under the guise of the ultimate act of charity. They were stripping me of my birthright and forcing me to applaud them for it. The rage came first, a white-hot silent scream that clawed its way up my throat. It was followed by a wave of crushing, absolute humiliation. I could feel hundreds of pairs of eyes on me. They were watching for my reaction. The banking magnates, the ambassadors, the socialites, my colleagues, my rivals. My parents had placed me in an impossible position. If I looked angry, I was ungrateful. If I looked devastated, I was selfish. So I did the only thing I had ever been taught to do. I performed. I let a single perfect tear trace a path down my cheek. I brought a hand to my mouth, my shoulders shaking just so. I composed my face into a mask of overwhelming, joyous disbelief, and then I rose to my feet, and I began to clap. My solitary applause was the spark. It ignited the entire room. Within seconds, all 500 guests were on their feet, a thunderous, rolling standing ovation that shook the crystal chandeliers. They were applauding my parents' generosity. They were applauding my public execution. Through the blur of my fake tears, I saw my parents beaming, accepting the adoration of the crowd. They looked over at me, their expressions smug and victorious. They had won. They had put me in my place, forever enshrining themselves as saints and me as their eternally grateful, dependent daughter. They came down from the stage and walked directly to me, enveloping me in a hug that was both suffocating and ice cold. The cameras flashed, capturing the perfect family moment. "Aren't you proud of us, darling?" My mother whispered into my hair, her voice dripping with saccharine triumph. I pulled back, my own smile a perfect, brilliant lie. My eyes met hers, and for a second I let the mask slip, just enough for her to see the Arctic coldness underneath. "Mother," I whispered back, my voice trembling with expertly feigned emotion. I am absolutely speechless. And in the silent, shattered ruins of my heart, a new foundation was being laid. It was not built on grief or sadness. It was built of something harder, colder, and far more enduring. It was built of pure, unadulterated rage. They had given me their money. They had given me their name. And I would use both to burn their world to the ground. The gala ended in a blur of congratulations. People swarmed me, their faces a mixture of pity and awe. "Your parents are saints, Annelise. What a legacy. You must be so incredibly proud." I accepted each comment with the grace of a grieving widow, my smile nailed in place, my eyes shining with unshed, fabricated tears. Inside, the cold rage was hardening into something far more useful, a plan. The next morning, the reality of my parents' grand gesture hit the foundation with the force of a tidal wave. My office, usually a sanctuary of calm, minimalist order, was buzzing. My deputy director, a sharp, sensible Swiss man named Liam, looked pale. "Annelise, the board is in emergency session," he said, handing me a tablet displaying the official notice of the bequest. The number had so many zeros it looked like a line of code. "They are..." ecstatic, overwhelmed. They're already talking about renaming the entire foundation after your parents. Of course they are, I said, my voice unnaturally calm. I took a sip of my black coffee. It tasted like nothing. Set up a meeting with the full board for this afternoon. I'll need a complete breakdown of the estate's asset portfolio stocks. Real estate, art holdings, everything, and Liam? Yes. Cancel my appointments for the rest of the day. I need time to think. He nodded, his expression a mixture of concern and admiration. He saw a dedicated director, stunned by an overwhelming gift, preparing to rise to the occasion. He had no idea he was looking at a general preparing her battlefield. Once he left, I closed the door to my glass-walled office, the silence a welcome balm. I stood at the floor-to-ceiling window, looking out over the placid, sun-dappled surface of Lake Geneva. My parents had made a critical error. In their rush to humiliate me and secure their own sainthood, they had overlooked one crucial detail. They had given me the weapon. They had given me their money, yes, but more importantly, they had given it to my foundation, an organization where my authority was absolute, my reputation impeccable, and my knowledge of the intricate legal and financial machinery was second to none. They thought they had written me out of their story. They had no idea I was about to become the editor. My mind, trained to manage complex humanitarian projects and navigate the treacherous waters of international finance, began to move with chilling speed and clarity. Rejecting the donation was out of the question. That would make me look petty and ungrateful, proving their silent point. Fighting it in court would be a long, ugly, and likely fruitless battle against the narrative they had. So perfectly crafted. No, I would not reject their gift. I would accept it. I would embrace it with a public display of gratitude so profound it would choke them. The plan formed not as a single vengeful act, but as a multi-stage campaign. A philanthropic blitzkrieg funded by their own fortune. It would be elegant, surgical, and utterly devastating. I wouldn't just tarnish their reputation. I would redefine it, twisting their legacy into a grotesque parody of their own values. They love their image. I would make their name synonymous with everything they secretly despised. When I met with the board that afternoon, I was the picture of composure and visionary leadership. They were practically vibrating with excitement, talking about expansion, new territories, grand projects. And of course, we will need a new name. The chairman, a stuffy old banker named Monsieur Renaud, declared. The Croix Global Relief Fund has a wonderful ring to it, don't you think? It does, I agreed smoothly, my heart like a stone. And my chest, but I have another idea. My parents' gift is one of legacy. Their name deserves to be attached not just to the foundation itself, but to a new, bold series of initiatives that will capture the public imagination. A living, breathing testament to their generosity. I walked them through my vision. I didn't present a plan for revenge. I presented a brilliant strategy for growth and public engagement. I proposed the Croix Legacy Initiative, a special high-profile fund managed by me dedicated to tackling difficult, controversial, and media-friendly issues. We can't just build wells anymore, I argued, my voice ringing with passion. We must be bolder. We must be on the cutting edge of philanthropy. We must be agents of change. The board was mesmerized. I was speaking their language, the language of branding, of influence, of legacy. They saw increased donations, glowing press coverage, and a seat at the global table. They didn't see the poison hidden in the heart of the proposal. By the end of the meeting, they had unanimously approved the creation of the initiative and had given me complete discretionary control over its first 5 million francs as a seed fund, drawn from the initial liquidation of my parents' stock portfolio. That evening, I went home to my starkly modern apartment, a place that had always felt more like a hotel suite than a home. I poured myself a glass of expensive wine one my father had gifted me last Christmas and opened my laptop. It was time to start spending my inheritance. My first move was to establish the initiative's advisory board. I didn't choose old, respectable figures. I meticulously selected my parents' greatest social and business rivals. There was the brash tech billionaire who had publicly called my father's real estate company a dinosaur. There was the avant-garde art gallery owner my mother despised, a woman she had once referred to as a peddler of pretentious trash. And as the crowning jewel, I invited a fiery, notoriously progressive journalist who had built her career exposing the hypocrisy of Europe's old money elite. To my parents, this board would not look like a collection of respected experts. It would look like a jury of their worst enemies. Next, I drafted the press release announcing the initiative's first project. It wouldn't be something safe and distant like a school in Africa. It would be local. It would be personal. For immediate release, the de la Croix Legacy Initiative announces inaugural project, the Geneva Heritage Grant. The Children's Global Relief Fund is proud to announce the first project under the newly formed de la Croix Legacy Initiative. The Geneva Heritage Grant will provide significant financial support to protect and preserve the city's historic artisan workshops and small businesses threatened by large-scale urban redevelopment. I knew exactly which large-scale urban redevelopment was currently the most controversial topic in the city's financial pages. It was a massive luxury condo project being driven by a consortium of investors. The lead investor? My father. The project required demolishing an entire block of old, beloved workshops, a master chocolatier, a family of bookbinders, a luthier who had been making violins in the same spot for 100 years. The public outcry was significant, but until now, the artisans had no financial means to fight back. Now they did. Their champion would be an initiative bearing the name of the very man trying to bulldoze them. I attached a quote from me to the press release. My parents taught me that a city's soul is not in its skyscrapers, but in its history and its people. With this grant, we honor their belief by protecting the heritage that makes Geneva truly special. I scheduled the press release to go out at 9 a.m. the next morning. Then I opened a new document. It was time to plan the initiative's second project. This one would be for my mother. She was a woman who valued appearances, discretion, and above all, the carefully maintained privacy of her social circle. She would adore this one. I began to type. Proposal. The Genevieve Delacroix Grant for Journalistic Integrity. The grant would provide funding for independent, long-form investigative journalism. Its first topic. An in-depth expose on the use of offshore tax havens and opaque art auction sales among Switzerland's wealthiest families. I leaned back, a thin, cruel smile touching my lips for the first time. The board had given me 5 million francs to start. It was a pittance compared to the full estate, but it was enough. It was more than enough to fire the first shots that my parents wanted a legacy. I was going to give them one. They would be remembered, not as saints, but as the clueless benefactors of their own spectacular downfall. I took another sip of wine, the irony burning brighter and more satisfying than the alcohol. They had hand-handed me a sword, thinking it was a trophy, and I was about to show them just how sharp it was. The morning after I sent the press release, my office was quiet. The calm before the storm. I sat at my desk, watching the sun climb higher over the city, my finger tracing the rim of my coffee cup. At precisely 9:01 a.m., my phone rang. The caller ID read my mom. I let it ring twice before answering, schooling my voice into a tone of pleasant surprise. Mother? Good morning. To what do I owe the pleasure? Annelise, darling. Her voice was a cascade of delighted soprano notes. I just saw the news alert. The Geneva Heritage Grant. It's absolutely wonderful. So thoughtful. I could hear the rustle of a newspaper in the background. She had only read the headline, of course. She'd seen our name attached to something noble and historic and hadn't bothered with the details. The irony was so thick it was almost suffocating. "I'm so glad you approve," I said, my voice a carefully constructed blend of humility and pride. I felt it was the perfect way to honor the spirit of your gift. It is. A city's soul is not in its skyscrapers. Oh, it's just perfect. Your father will be so pleased. Everyone will be talking about it. I must go, darling. I have to call Helene von Hessel and tell her all about it. She hung up, leaving me in the echoing silence. She was calling her best friend to brag about an initiative that was about to publicly humiliate her husband. It was more perfect than I could have possibly imagined. The fallout was not immediate, but it was decisive. The story was immediate, darling. It had everything: beleaguered local artisans, a soulless corporate developer, and a mysterious, powerful benefactor sweeping in to save the day. That benefactor, the Croix Legacy Initiative, was hailed as a new progressive force in Swiss philanthropy. My father, Charles de la Croix, was by extension cast as the villain. Newspapers ran split-screen photos. On one side, the wizened, flour-dusted face of the master chocolatier. On the other, a file photo of my father looking stern and predatory. He wasn't just a developer anymore. He was the man trying to crush history under the heel of his bespoke leather shoe. His name, which he had spent a lifetime polishing to a brilliant sheen, was being dragged through the mud. And the mud was being slung by a foundation bearing that very same name. He didn't call me for 3 days. 3 days in which I imagined the furious calls he must have been fielding from his investors and his lawyers. When he finally did, his voice was a low, dangerous growl. "Annelise, my office, now." "Father," I replied, my tone breezy, "I'm afraid." "I can't. I have a luncheon with the artisans we're supporting. The press will be there. I can't possibly cancel. You understand." I heard a sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line, then silence. He had hung up. He understood perfectly. He was trapped. He couldn't publicly condemn my actions without looking like a monster, and he couldn't privately command me to stop. I had used his own desire for a positive public image as the bars of his cage. A week later, I launched the second initiative. I held a small, sober press conference in a modern art gallery, the one owned by my mother's social nemesis. I stood on a small podium flanked by my new advisory board. The tech billionaire smirked for the cameras while the firebrand journalist, my News Star appointment, spoke with passion about the sacred duty of the free press to hold power accountable, no matter how wealthy or well-connected. I announced the Genevieve de la Croix Grant for Journalistic Integrity. Its mission, I explained, was to fund fearless, independent reporting on complex socioeconomic issues. The first recipient was a consortium of international journalists, led by a Pulitzer Prize winner from Le Monde. Their first topic, a 6-month investigation into undisclosed asset management and tax optimization through Swiss Freeports and shell corporations. This time, the phone call from my mother came within the hour. Her voice was no longer delighted. It was a thin, tight wire of panic. "Annelise, what have you done?" "What do you mean, Mother?" "I've just secured our family's name as a patron of truth and transparency. Isn't it wonderful?" I asked, the feigned innocence a razor's edge in my voice. "The Von Hessels just called me," she shrieked, her carefully constructed composure cracking. Helene was screaming, Annelise. "Apparently, this journalist you funded has been digging into her family's art trust for weeks, the one they keep at the Geneva Freeport. She accused us of bankrolling a witch hunt against our own friends." "Mother," I said, my voice dripping with sympathy, "I am as shocked as you are. The grant has a very strict policy of non-interference. It would be highly unethical for us to influence their reporting. Surely the Von Hessels have nothing to hide. This is for the greater good, a core value of our family, as you so beautifully articulated at the gala. I could almost hear her sputtering, choking on the sanctimonious words I was feeding back to her. She was silent for a long moment. When she spoke again, her voice was low and trembling with a rage she couldn't afford to unleash. You will regret this, Annelise. The unraveling was a joy to behold. It was death by 1,000 paper cuts. Invitations to dinners and ski weekends in Gstaad mysteriously stopped arriving. When my parents attended the opera, they found themselves sitting in a circle of empty seats, their former friends having suddenly fallen ill or been called away on business. I saw it myself at an auction at Christie's. My parents stood near a rotting sculpture, looking isolated and radioactive. People would catch their eye, offer a tight, brittle smile, and then turn away, moving to the other side of the room. They were no longer royalty. They were pariahs, haunted by the ghost of their own celebrated generosity. The whispers followed them everywhere. Can you believe the audacity? Funding an investigation into their own circle? I heard Charles de la Croix lost millions when that condo deal fell through. Serves him right. Genevieve looks dreadful. They say she hasn't been invited to a proper dinner party in a month. Meanwhile, I was thriving. I was the darling of the nonprofit world. The de la Croix Legacy Initiative was a staggering success. Public donations, especially small-scale online ones, had skyrocketed. We were flooded with positive press. I was hailed as a visionary, a new breed of philanthropist who wasn't afraid to get her hands dirty. My parents, of course, tried to fight back. My father attempted to leverage his influence with Monsieur Reynaud, the chairman of the board. It was a foolish, desperate move. Annelise, Reynaud said, sitting stiffly in the chair opposite my desk a few days later. I've received some concerned calls. From your father, from others on whose boards he sits. But they feel the initiatives are perhaps a bit aggressive. I smiled and pushed a thick, beautifully bound dossier across the desk. Aggressive, Monsieur Reynaud, I would call it effective. In this folder, you will find a complete report. Our public engagement is up by 400%. Our online donations have quadrupled. We have received glowing profiles in the Financial Times and The Guardian. We are being lauded as the future of philanthropy. On page 12, you will see a list of major new donors who have pledged support specifically because of the bold direction of the initiatives. He opened the folder and slowly began to read. His eyebrows climbed higher with every page he turned. He saw the numbers, the charts, the headlines. He saw progress. He saw success. My father and his friends are the past, Monsieur Reynaud, I said softly, leaning forward. They belong to an era of quiet, self-serving charity that buys silence and prestige. The world has changed. Our donors want transparency. They want impact. They want change. You and the board can either stand with a handful of angry oligarchs who are upset that someone is finally looking at their accounting, or you can stand with me, with the public, with the future of this foundation. He closed the dossier, his expression unreadable, but I knew I had won. He was a banker. He understood numbers better than he understood loyalty. Your report is most compelling, Director, he said, rising to his feet. Carry on. You have the board's full confidence. With their last avenue of attack cut off, they were left with only one option, the direct approach. The next morning, I received an email from my father's personal assistant. It was not a request. It was a command. Monsieur Delacroix and Mrs. Day. Lacroix will be at your office tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock to see you. No pleasantries, no subject line. Just a declaration of impending war. I closed the email and leaned back in my chair, a slow, predatory smile spreading across my face. I looked out the window at the sparkling lake. The water was calm, but a storm was coming. My storm didn't let them come. The morning of the confrontation, I arrived at the office an hour early. I wanted to be settled, to own the space before they arrived. My office was my fortress. It was a testament to everything I had built myself. A corner suite on the top floor with panoramic floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Lake Geneva and the Jet Dow. The furniture was sleek, minimalist, and unforgiving black leather, chrome, and glass. Not a single personal photograph adorned the space. It was a room, designed for power, not comfort. It was the polar opposite of the stuffy, antique-filled mansions my parents inhabited at exactly 9:59 a.m. My assistant's voice came through the intercom, tight with anxiety. "Director, your parents are here." "Send them in, Claire," I said. My voice even. I didn't rise from my seat. I remained behind my large glass desk, my hands steepled in front of me. I watched the door open and they entered, not as the regal couple from the gala, but as two thunderclouds of condensed fury. Father's face was a rigid mask of anger, his jaw clenched so tightly I was surprised his teeth didn't crack. Mother, trailing a step behind him, had eyes that burned with a cold reptilian fire. The air in the room instantly grew heavy, charged with the ozone of a coming storm. They didn't greet me. They didn't even bother to close the door. Father marched to the front of my desk and slammed his palms down on the glass surface. The sound cracked through the quiet office like a gunshot. "What?" he hissed, his voice low and shaking with rage. "Do you think you are doing?" I didn't flinch. I held his gaze, my expression one of mild professional inquiry. "Good morning, Father." "To what specifically are you referring? Do not play games with me, Annelise." He roared, his composure finally snapping. "The heritage. Grant, my condo development is in ruins. The investors are pulling out, my partners are threatening to sue. You have publicly humiliated me. I have publicly celebrated local culture," I corrected him gently. "I use the family name, our name, to champion the underdog and preserve history. The press has been overwhelmingly positive. The public sees it as a noble act." "Isn't that what you wanted? A legacy? This is not a legacy, it's a betrayal." My mother cut in, her voice sharp and brittle. "And this grotesque journalistic integrity fund? You have 6 reporters on our oldest friends. The Dubois family isn't speaking to us. The Von Hessels crossed the street to avoid me. Yesterday, you have systematically poisoned our entire social circle. I've funded the pursuit of truth and transparency, Mother," I said, turning my calm gaze to her. "A core tenet of any reputable charitable foundation. It would be unethical to direct their investigations. I assumed your friends, pillars of the community that they are, would have nothing to hide." Every word was a poisoned dart, dipped in their own sanctimonious rhetoric and fired back at them. I watched them absorb the impact, their fury warring with their inability to refute the twisted logic. "This is not about ethics," Father bellowed, pointing a trembling finger at me. "This is about you. A petty, vindictive tantrum because you didn't get your inheritance." "My inheritance?" I let out a soft, cold laugh. It was the first sound in the room that held any genuine emotion. "You seem to be confused. I did get my inheritance. All of it. You delivered it to me on a silver platter in front of 500 witnesses. I am merely being a faithful steward of the donation. I am using the Croix fortune to do good works, just as you intended. We intended to build schools, to feed starving children." Mother cried, her voice rising with hysteria. "Not to bankroll our own public immolation. The foundation already does that, and does it very well," I said calmly. The Croix Legacy Initiative is about innovation. It's about being bold. It's about creating a narrative. The very things you taught me were most important. Father straightened up, his face purple with rage. He tried to reclaim his authority, to issue a command as he had done my entire life. This stops. Now, you will shut down these initiatives. You will issue a public apology for this mess, and you will resign from your position. The board will listen to me. This was the moment. The final desperate lunge for control. I let him have it. I let the silence stretch, watching the hope flicker in his eyes. The belief that he was and always would be the one in charge. Then I leaned forward, my smile serene. No, Father, they won't. What did you say? He whispered, his bravado deflating. I said they won't, I repeated, my voice clear and cutting. I met with Monsieur Renaud and the board last week. I walked them through the initiative's performance metrics. Our public donations have increased by over 400% since the launch. Our media impressions are in the hundreds of millions. We have become the most talked about, most lauded philanthropic organization in Europe. They see a visionary director leading the foundation into a bold, successful future. You, on the other hand, they see as a disgruntled donor trying to meddle in the foundation's internal affairs, because a few of your billionaire friends are uncomfortable with having their tax returns scrutinized. The color drained from his face. He stared at me, the dawning comprehension of his own powerlessness, a horrifying spectacle to behold. He had no leverage. His money was no longer his. His influence was gone. He had given it all to me. You see, I continued, my voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. You raised me in your world. A world where public perception is the only currency that matters. And right now, my approval rating is stratospheric. Yours, not so much. The board will not remove me. They cannot afford to. I am the brand now, the Delacroix brand. My mother looked as if I had physically struck her. She staggered back a step, her hand flying to her throat. You wouldn't, she breathed. You are our daughter. You decided the terms of our relationship when you stood on that stage, I said, my voice devoid of all warmth. You chose to make our family business a public affair. I am simply following your lead. They were broken. The fury was gone, replaced by a hollow, gaping wound of defeat. They stared at me, this creature they had created but no longer recognized, this woman who was using their own rulebook to destroy them. It was time for the final act, the coup de grace. I swiveled my monitor around to face them. On the screen was a stunningly realistic architectural rendering of a gleaming, ultra-modern building of white stone and sweeping glass, situated on the edge of the lake. But I do agree with you on one thing, I said brightly. We must think of the future. The initiatives have been so successful that I have been given approval to use the bulk of the estate's capital on a capstone project, a permanent physical monument to your generosity. They stared at the screen, confused. It will be a major contribution to the city's cultural landscape, I explained. A new museum. We acquired the land last month. I paused, letting my eyes drift to my father. It's that prime parcel of lakeside real estate you wanted for your hotel, Father. I know how much you wanted it, so when it came on the market, I made sure we got it. I imagine the board of your development company will be disappointed again. He looked like he was going to be sick. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. And, I said, turning to my mother with a sweet, devastating smile, in your honor, Mother, for your impeccable taste and lifelong patronage of the arts, we have already settled on a name. I clicked the mouse. Bold letters appeared across the top of the architectural rendering. The Genevieve de L. Croix Center for Unconventional Art It will house one of Europe's largest collections of provocative, avant-garde, and political performance. Art, I said, savoring every word. The kind of challenging, unconventional work you've always so famously despised. Your name will be forever associated with it. That, my dear parents, is your legacy, permanent, public, and paid for entirely by you. That was it, the final blow. There was nothing left to say. My father, a man I had never seen show weakness in his life, seemed to shrink before my eyes. He looked old, defeated. He turned, without another word, and walked stiffly out of my office. My mother gave me one last look, a look of utter soul-shattering hatred, and followed him. I watched them go. I listened to their footsteps fade down the hall. I was alone again in my silent glass fortress. I swiveled the monitor back around and looked at the image of the museum. My museum, that would be built on the ashes of their world. I had won. The revenge was absolute. And the only thing I felt was the vast, cold, echoing silence of my victory. After they were gone, the silence they left behind was louder than their shouting. It pressed in on me from all sides, a physical weight. In the air of my pristine, glass-walled office, I remained at my desk for a long time, staring at the architectural rendering on my screen. The Genevieve de la Croix Center for Unconventional Art. It was a monument to my victory, a masterpiece of vengeance. Every sharp angle, every pane of glass, every square meter of land was a testament to the fact that I had comprehensively and irrevocably broken them. I had won. The intercom buzzed, startling me. Director? It was Claire, my assistant. Her voice was hesitant, timid. Are you all right? I'm fine, Claire, I said, my voice sounding distant and strange to my own ears. Please hold my calls. For the next hour. Of course, Director. I swiveled my chair to face the window, looking down at the city I now figuratively owned. The jet dough plumed into the sky, a triumphant spray of water against the backdrop of the Alps. It was a perfect, beautiful day. I felt nothing. The fire of my rage, the fuel that had driven my every action for weeks, had burned out completely. And in its place was a vast, cold, and silent crater. The vengeful god, having smote her enemies, found her heaven empty. The public narrative, of course, was one of unmitigated triumph. The news of the museum and its audacious name was met with a wave of press that was even more ecstatic than before. I was hailed as a cultural revolutionary, a philanthropic visionary. My parents, in their pained, dignified silence, were seen as relics who had unwittingly funded a future that had no place for them. My victory was so complete, so absolute that it was boring. The game was over. The enemy was vanquished. And I was left alone on the battlefield with nothing to do but count the dead. That evening, I stayed late, long after the last employee had gone home. The building was quiet, the sky outside a deep bruised purple. I was reviewing construction, proposals, the numbers and timelines, a meaningless jumble in front of me, when a soft knock came at my open door. It was Liam, my deputy director, holding 2 mugs. I saw the light on, he said, his voice gentle. I figured you could use this. It's that herbal tea you like, the one for stress. Thank you, Liam, I said, accepting the mug. Its warmth was a small, welcome comfort. He didn't leave. He leaned against the doorframe, his expression unreadable. Liam was smart. He wasn't a gossip or a sycophant. He was a quiet observer who saw everything. He had seen my initial shock at the gala, my cold fury the next day, and the meticulous surgical precision of my every move since. He never commented. He just did his job with quiet efficiency. The board is calling you a miracle worker, he said. Renaud told me this morning that you're the best thing that ever happened to this foundation. The numbers are good, I replied. noncommittally staring into my tea. "The numbers are astronomical," he corrected me. "And your parents?" "I haven't heard from them," I said, which was the truth. He was quiet for a long moment, watching me. Then he asked the question that I had been both dreading and longing for someone to ask. The one question that mattered: was it worth it, Annelise? I looked up at him, and for the first time in my adult life, I felt the mask of the perfect, composed director crack. I had no answer for him. I had destroyed them. I had taken their money, their name, their social standing, and their pride. I had repaid their public humiliation 1,000 times over. I had achieved a revenge so total it would be whispered about in Geneva for decades. And as I sat there in my silent, empty office, surrounded by the spoils of my war, I felt more alone than I had ever been in my life. The wound they had inflicted on me at that gala was not the first. It was merely the final, deepest cut in a lifetime of them. And destroying the knife hadn't healed the wound. I shook my head, a small, almost imperceptible movement. "I don't know," I whispered, the admission costing me more than I could have imagined. That night, I walked home instead of taking a car. The cool night air felt good on my face. I walked along the edge of the lake, the city lights shimmering on the dark water. I thought about my life, a long series of achievements designed to win the approval of two people who were incapable of giving it. I had built my career, my entire identity, in opposition to them. Even my revenge, my grand masterpiece of rebellion, had been all about them. Every decision, every project, every perfectly crafted insult was a reaction to Charles and Geneviève de la Croix. My victory hadn't freed me from them. It had chained me to them more tightly than ever before. Their downfall was now the defining story of my life. To be truly free, I realized I had to stop reacting. I had to do something that had absolutely nothing to do with them. The next week was spent in a flurry of meetings with architects, engineers, and city planners for the new museum. I was professional, efficient, and decisive. I approved budgets, signed contracts, and reviewed blueprints. The project was moving forward, a testament to my power. But it still felt hollow, like their ghost was haunting every decision. On Friday afternoon, I was alone in my office, looking at the final, detailed schematics. The Geneviève de la Croix Center for Unconventional Art. The name still brought a faint, bitter smile to my lips. It was perfect, it was cruel, and it was still, ultimately, about my mother. I zoomed in on the centerpiece of the design. The architects had proposed a stark, minimalist central courtyard with a single, massive, and vaguely unsettling metal sculpture. It was meant to be the heart of the museum. I stared at it, and I felt nothing but a profound sense of exhaustion down my mind drifted. Back. Not to the gala, not to the arguments, but further. To a childhood memory I hadn't revisited in years. I was 6 or 7 years old, visiting my paternal grandmother, Adeline, at her small country house near Annecy. My parents were there, of course bored and impatient to get back to the city. But my grandmother had taken me by the hand and led me into her garden. It was a beautiful, chaotic, English-style garden, overflowing with flowers whose names she taught me. She showed me how to press a pansy in a heavy book, how to tell a bee from a wasp. She didn't care if my dress got dirty. She just smiled, a genuine, warm smile that had nothing to do with how I looked or what I had achieved. It was the only memory from my childhood of unconditional, uncomplicated affection. Adeline had died when I was 10. She left me her collection of botanical watercolors, which my mother had promptly stored in an attic, deeming them amateurish. I looked back at the blueprint on my screen, at the cold, sterile courtyard, at the aggressive, unsettling sculpture. I picked up the phone and called the lead architect. "Jean-Pierre," I said, my voice clear and firm, filled with a purpose that felt entirely new. I'm making a change to the central courtyard design, a significant one. I spent the next hour talking, sketching, explaining. I sent him photos of my grandmother's watercolors that I had scanned years ago. I described the flowers from my memory. I tore down the cold, minimalist heart of my vengeful museum and began to build something new in its place. The following Monday, I presented the revised plan to Liam. He looked at the new rendering on my screen, his eyes widening in surprise. The stark courtyard was gone. In its place was a stunning glass conservatory, a lush, vibrant indoor garden filled with flowers, climbing vines, and quiet benches. Natural light streamed in from a domed glass ceiling. The walls of the conservatory were not bare. They were designed to be a gallery. "What is this?" he asked softly. "This," I said, pointing to the text at the bottom of the rendering, "is the heart of a museum." The text read, "The Adeline de la Croix Memorial Garden and Gallery. The main museum will still bear my mother's name." I explained. "The public humiliation is a done deal, but the center of it, the soul of the building, that will be for me. For something real." Liam looked from the plans to my face. He didn't see a vengeful god or a ruthless director. He saw something else, beginning to grow in the crater of my victory. He smiled, a real warm smile. "I think it's the best idea you've ever had, Annelise." And for the first time, I believed it was. The emptiness in my chest hadn't vanished, but it no longer felt like a void. It felt like space to build something new. My parents had wanted a legacy of public adoration. I had given them one of public shame. But my own legacy, the one I would build for myself, would not be about them at all. It would not be about revenge or victory or power dot. It would be about a quiet, sunlit garden. And it would be entirely, beautifully, and finally my own. 3 years. 3 years had passed since the day my parents walked out of my office, broken. 3 years since the war had ended and the quiet had begun. The Genevieve de la Croix Center for Unconventional Art was no longer an architectural rendering on my screen. It was a landmark. It stood on the shore of Lake Geneva, a striking, beautiful scar on the city's skyline, hailed by critics as one of the most important cultural institutions to open in Europe this decade. It was a resounding success. And it was my gilded cage. I was no longer the vengeful daughter. I was a respected, almost feared, figure in the art and philanthropic worlds. My name carried weight. When I spoke, people listened. I had everything I had ever thought I wanted: power, independence, respect. My revenge was not just complete, it was legend. But victory, I had learned, has its own unique form of gravity. It holds you in orbit around the event, tethered to the memory of the war long after the battlefield has gone quiet. The news of my parents was sparse. They had sold their mansion in Geneva and moved to a smaller, quieter home in the countryside near Lyon, retreating from a world that no longer welcomed them. They had faded from the society pages, their names replaced by new power players. They were, for all intents and purposes, ghosts. And I, in many ways, was the one who was haunted about my favorite place in the world. My only true sanctuary was the Adeline de la Croix Memorial Garden and Gallery, the heart of the museum. It was late on a Tuesday evening in autumn, long after the last of the patrons had departed. I often stayed late, finding a strange peace in the building's silence. I was walking through the lush, climate-controlled garden, the scent of damp earth and night-blooming jasmine filling the air. This space was the one part of my victory that felt clean. It was an act of creation, not destruction. It was a memory of love in a building forged from hate. The glass walls of the conservatory looked out over the dark, shimmering lake. I was admiring a new orchid that had just bloomed when I heard the soft, hesitant footsteps on the marble floor behind me. I turned, expecting to see a member of the late-night security staff, but it wasn't. Standing at the entrance to the garden, framed by the doorway, were my parents. The shock was a physical jolt, a sudden intake of breath that felt like ice in my lungs. I hadn't seen them in person since. That day at my office, they looked smaller. The 3 years had stripped them of their power, and the loss was visible. Father's imposing frame seemed to stoop slightly, his expensive suit hanging on him as if it were a size too large. The permanent look of command in his eyes had been replaced by a weary, guarded emptiness. Mother was still impeccably dressed, but the effort showed. There were lines around her eyes and mouth that her pride and makeup could no longer conceal. They were no longer the lions I had defeated. They were two old, tired people. They didn't approach me. They simply stood there, looking not at me, but at the garden around me. Their eyes took in the climbing roses, the lush ferns, the quiet stone benches. They completely ignored the provocative, challenging art visible in the galleries just beyond the glass. They had come here, to this one specific room in the vast monument to their humiliation. I was the one who broke the silence. My voice was steady, betraying none of the turmoil inside me. Mother. Father. My mother's eyes finally met mine. There was no fire in them anymore, just a deep, settled weariness. Annelise, she said, her voice quiet, almost fragile. She took a tentative step into the garden. We were in the city for a doctor's appointment. We wanted to see it, see the museum. I asked, though I knew that wasn't the truth. No, she said, shaking her head slightly. She gestured vaguely at a cluster of white pansies, the same kind my grandmother used to press in her books. To see this, the garden. My father remained silent, his gaze fixed on a small plaque near the entrance I had insisted on. It read, "In loving memory of Adeline de la Croix. To plant a garden is to believe in tomorrow." He read the words, and a muscle worked in his jaw. It wasn't anger. It was something else. Something I couldn't name. This was the last thing I had ever expected. A confrontation, yes. An angry letter from their lawyers, a bitter, accidental run-in at a restaurant. But not this. Not a quiet, mournful pilgrimage to the one part of my creation that wasn't about them. "It's beautiful," my mother said, her voice barely a whisper. Adeline, she would have loved it. This admission from a woman who had once dismissed her. Mother-in-law's passion as a messy, common hobby was more shocking than any shout. It was a concession. It was a surrender. She was acknowledging a truth she had spent her whole life denying, that the simple, genuine affection Adeline represented was something of value, something they had lost, something they had destroyed. She was a good woman, my father said suddenly, his voice thick. He was still looking at the plaque bearing his mother's name. A kind woman, and in that moment I understood. They hadn't come to see me. They hadn't come to fight or to apologize or to ask for anything. They had come to mourn. Not for their money, not for their social standing, but for something far more elemental. They had come to the grave of the one person in their family who represented pure, unconditional love, a grave I had built inside the palace of my revenge. I felt the last vestiges of my triumphant anger dissolve, leaving nothing behind but a profound, aching sadness. The victory I had savored for so long suddenly felt like a Pyrrhic one. I had burned down their world, but the fire had consumed the last, faint possibility of ever having a real family. We were 3 strangers standing in a beautiful garden, separated by a chasm of our own making. "Yes," I said softly. She was. There was nothing else to say. We stood in silence for another minute, the only sound the gentle hum of the conservatory's climate control. They looked around one last time, like tourists in a foreign land. Before turning to leave Dot, my mother paused at the doorway and looked back at me. Goodbye, Annelise, she said. There was no malice in it, no threat, just a statement of fact. A final closing of a door that had been shut for years. Goodbye, Mother, I replied, and then they were gone. I stood alone in the Adeline. The La Croix Memorial Garden, the echo of their presence slowly fading. I had wanted revenge, and I had achieved it. I had wanted them to feel the pain and humiliation they had inflicted on me, and they had. I had wanted to win, and I had. But watching them walk away, two broken, elderly people stripped of everything, I felt no joy, no satisfaction. Just the cold, clear, and undeniable truth that my revenge had given me power. It had given me freedom, but it had not and could not give me back the one thing I had truly wanted all along. Parents who loved me. I reached out and touched the soft petal of an orchid. The garden was silent, beautiful, and entirely my own. The war was over. The echoes were fading, and for the first time, I felt the quiet, solemn weight of what it meant to be truly, completely, and irrevocably alone. It was the price of my victory. And now my work was to learn how to live with it.